What if Otis Redding went baroque pop? Find out on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hello, my name is Morgan Brown, and for the past few months I've been making a series of videos that I call What If videos. The idea is that every week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe scenario in which a different set of circumstances or a decision that someone's made cause that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that record and record my own backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have to hand to try and realise that version of the song. So this week, the song I took on was Sitting on the Dock of the Bay by Otis Redding, and I tried to reimagine that in a baroque pop style. If you haven't had a chance to hear it yet, it goes a little bit like this.
I've had nothing to live for. Look like nothing's gonna come my way. So I'm just gonna sit on the dock of the bay, watching the tide roll away. Sitting on the dock of the bay, wasting time. Looks like nothing's gonna change. Everything still remains the same.
So Otis Redding obviously is one of the definitive voices of soul music, taken from As Much Too Soon back in December of 1967. But in the short time that he was with us, he made a pretty indelible mark on popular music, both in terms of shaping the course of soul music itself and in terms of broadening its appeal and branching out towards other markets. By the mid-60s, he was really firmly established as one of the leading lights of soul music, with albums like the Otis Blue LP, which is certainly the first Otis Redding record I ever owned. He very much defined that Stax Volt kind of Memphis soul sound as distinct from what, say, Motown were doing. Less slick and less poppy and more down-to-earth gospel and R&B centered kind of soul music. And I think he was just the right combination of a magnetic personality, superb on-stage performer, a great songwriter, and just a fantastic singer as well. From starting out playing in people's backing bands, including for a little while Little Richard. I know Little Richard is one of his early influences as well. By the mid-60s, Otis establishes himself as a formidable solo act. We start to see Otis making some pretty bold moves into the kind of territory that's generally occupied by these sort of white rock acts. So he's doing things like playing the Whiskey A Go-Go, and then notably in 1967 gets invited to perform at the Monterey Pop Festival alongside a lot of rock acts of the day, including the Animals, Simon & Garfunkel, the Byrds, Jefferson Airplane. And this is a pretty big cultural crossover moment. Goes down an absolute storm. It's a legendary performance. And yeah, it's a real breakout moment for Otis, and shows him leading the way really for soul artists to break out of their own niche and take on these broader markets. We know from various accounts of people who worked with him during the rest of 1967 that, among other things, he'd been listening to the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album and was talking to his collaborators about wanting to expand his sound in similar ways, wanting to take in some of these kind of broader influences. And I believe Sitting on the Dock of the Bay was the first evidence of him attempting to do this. Now, a lot of people just grew up with this song as a kind of ever-present classic hit. So certainly to me, growing up, it always just sounded like a great old soul song. It doesn't sound like anything unusual, but knowing that at the time Otis was looking to expand his sound, there are a couple of different things about it. It's certainly quite an unusual chord structure for a soul song at the time. A lot of soul music was still pretty much based in blues or gospel progressions, and Dock of the Bay doesn't do that. It's quite different. Also, lyrically, it's pretty interesting too. It's co-written with Steve Cropper, and it's quite cool the way they worked. It wasn't one person writing the lyrics, one person writing the music. I think Otis came in with the first verse possibly and some musical ideas, and then Steve Cropper's fleshed this out into a story using elements of Otis's autobiography. But yeah, it's a fascinating lyric, quite profound in a way, telling the story of this guy who's come on this big journey trying to follow a dream. None of it's come to anything, and he's finally arrived at this point sitting at the dock watching the sea. It is really sorrowful. Lines like, I have nothing to live for, nothing's going to come my way. In spite of that, there's still a weirdly carefree feeling to it. It's almost like he's gone through this sorrow and come out the other side and has arrived at this sort of peaceful place. It's almost a Zen statement, really. But that was just the first example of Otis trying to incorporate some of these new influences into his sound. He then had a few live dates to do a TV show over in Cleveland, and then him and the Marquis, who were touring as his backing band, were going to fly on to the next date, which was in Madison, Wisconsin, I think. And unfortunately, the plane went down the lake. Everyone apart from one member of the Marquis was killed. So the world never found out exactly how Otis was intending to continue developing his music, what he might have done with these new influences he was taking in, which obviously is one of the great tragedies in the history of popular music. So what I was thinking with this week's video was, okay, so what if that tragedy hadn't happened? Otis has lived into 1968, gets to go back in the studio. What is his next direction going to be? In all likelihood, it would have probably continued to evolve in a fairly subtle way, just bringing in like little bits of extra influences, moving towards more of an album-focused direction, in the same way that shortly after this, you saw the likes of Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye developing with their great albums of the late 60s. But my thought was, what if the evolution wasn't subtle, and in fact, he just really took on board all the stuff that was happening in rock music and white pop at the time and made an out-and-out baroque pop record. So baroque pop, it's a pretty nebulous genre term, really. If you're being very strict about it, I guess you'd say that it's a particular strand of pop music of the mid to late 60s that incorporated elements of actual baroque music. So harpsichords, oboes and things, the formal aspects of baroque music. I didn't really mean it like that. More broadly, people tend to use baroque pop as a way of describing the kind of popular music that sprang up in the wake of the mid-60s works of the Beatles and the Beach Boys. So post-Pet Sounds and Revolver, and particularly after Sgt. Pepper as well. Pop acts expanding their sound, taking in a broader palette of influences and a wider range of instrumentation to create more elaborately structured works, really. This kind of thing is inextricably linked with the psychedelic movement in pop. But I differentiate baroque pop from psychedelic rock in the sense that when we say psychedelic rock, I tend to think a bit more of more consciously trippy music, things like the Grateful Dead, looser, more improvisatory music, whereas baroque pop is very much still a disciplined form based on advances in recording and more complex arrangements in the studio, a lot of which arose from what George Martin had been doing with the Beatles. So you get, I guess, the Kinks moving in a similar direction, starting with Something Else by the Kinks through the Village Green Preservation Society, the Zombies on Odyssey and Oracle, the Moody Blues certainly with Days of Future Past, over in the States, Love as well with Forever Changes, you could reasonably put in that kind of bracket too. Beyond that, the likes of Barry Ryan with Eloise, I think, is a great example of baroque pop, or even, I've never been a big fan of it, but Excerpt from a Teenage Opera by Keith West, I think, has to fall into that category too. Just these ambitious pop songs, or bits of classical instrumentation, elements of different genres just mixed in, you know, maybe bits of vaudeville, hints of music hall, sometimes elements of Dixieland jazz. Anything's fair game, really. It's all thrown in together. So that's kind of what I was thinking when I was coming up with my idea of how Otis's music might have developed. So to try and turn Sitting on the Dock of the Bay into a baroque pop record, my first thought was I just had to make it more complex because it's a pretty simple song. And my thought was, I'm going to divide this up into sections so that we can have each section having its own sort of separate identity. On GarageBand, having been using it for years, I recently discovered the tempo track, so you can have different sections of a song in different tempos, and you can speed up and slow down in the middle of a song. So I figured, okay, I'm going to have a slow introduction, going to take it up a notch for the first couple of verses and choruses, and then when we get to the middle eight, that's going to go double time, and then for the last verse and chorus I was going to go a bit slower so it's a bit grander. And then for the whistling section at the end, I figured I was going to turn that into some kind of elaborate marching band type scenario. So quite a lot to pack into a 3-minute song. So the intro, rather than using any conventional rock instrumentation, I decided I was going to use harp and celeste. With the harp particularly, I was thinking of She's Leaving Home by the Beatles. Obviously, the Beatles are looming fairly large in what I'm thinking of doing on this track. I treated Otis's voice on this section to make it kind of lo-fi. I put a mid-range EQ hump on it, which makes it kind of sound like it's coming out of a transistor radio, which I thought was kind of cool. Like on the original record, we've got some seaside sound effects, just some waves and some seagulls. To make it a bit more psychedelic, I just fed that through a tape echo and a flanger just to make it sound a little bit trippy.
Sitting in the morning sun, I'll be sitting with the evening come.
Then we go into the kind of full band section. So it's just kind of a fairly basic rock band setup, bass, drums, and 2 guitars. The drums, I did my best to program it to sound a little bit Ringo-ish. I mean, only Ringo can sound like Ringo, but I tried to throw in a few of his kind of signature fills. Also compressed them in a way that I think makes them sound a little bit more Beatlesy. So slow release compression on the cymbals, which gives them a kind of really long, slightly odd sounding sustain. And I also tried to make the bass sound a little bit McCartney-ish. I, again, can't really play the bass like Paul McCartney, but I threw in a few of those high melodic fills and things just to try and give it a bit of that flavour. The guitars, one of them is just kind of playing fairly straight ahead, kind of strummed chords. The other one's doing a bit of a broken chord thing. Again, thinking of the Beatles, the likes of sort of what's happening on She Said from Revolver, or even the more up-tempo sections of Strawberry Fields, those kind of jangly broken chords, which I thought would sound pretty cool on there. I don't know if anyone's actually interested in nerdy stuff like what guitar I was using. It occurs to me I've never explained that on any of these videos, but if you did wonder, both guitars on this track were this. This is my homemade Telecaster. I made this from a £50 kit from eBay a few years ago. Apart from the electronics, which I bought separately because the ones that came with the kit were terrible. But yeah, I've used this on a lot of these what if videos, and I found it to be surprisingly versatile, and it served me really well. So yeah, just basic guitar band on that section. Apart from the Mellotron, I discovered as well this week that GarageBand has a really good Mellotron section, which I hadn't got onto at all before. So we've got Mellotron flutes just parping away in the left-hand speaker there, and then in the second verse I bring in some strings as well. I think I start with violins and then bring in a Mellotron cello as well. If you're not familiar with the Mellotron, it's almost like a kind of pre-digital form of sampling, a keyboard instrument, but each key would operate a tape loop. So it allowed you to use orchestral sounds without having to have an orchestra there, because you've got these tapes of orchestral sounds that you're playing. And at the time, I think it caused quite a scandal, and the Musicians Union were very upset because they thought it was going to put people out of jobs. Didn't really, because a Mellotron doesn't really sound like real musicians. It sounds like this kind of lo-fi, warbly version of real instruments, but it's great for evoking that late 60s sound. Obviously the Beatles used it quite a lot. The Moody Blues famously made great use of it on Days of Future Past, but it's all over a lot of records of that era. And then I get to the middle 8 section, and I decided I was going to go double time, and my inspiration for that bit, again being the Beatles, I was thinking this time of the middle section of A Day in the Life. We go back to the lo-fi transistor radio vocal. I've got a piano on there that's doing a little bit of a slightly ragtimey thing. I'm a terrible pianist, so it took quite a while to get that right. I just played it as best I could. I had to do each hand separately, and then it took a lot of tidying up to actually make it sound like it was being played properly, but I think it came out sounding pretty decent. I had it start adding some brass in at that point too. There's a tuba in there, doubling the bass line. And then when we come out of that, the tempo slows right down, and then we're back into the verse with the bigger instrumentation. So as well as the mellotron, we've now got a full horn section with trumpets and trombones as well. Those are using the Spitfire Audio BBC Symphony Orchestra plugin, which I've used in a lot of these videos, and it just sounds great, I think. So the last verse just has this really big instrumentation, the horns and the mellotron strings. There's an oboe in there as well. And then as we get to the outro section where it's Otis whistling, it's quite a bad isolation of the vocal, I should say. It didn't come out that clearly, and the whistling kind of got lost, so there's only really one time through the pattern of whistling that was really usable. So I treated it electronically. I put a chorusing effect on it and then put that through a rotating speaker simulator, which created this kind of masked whistling effect. So it's like an army of people whistling, and then just looped that round at the end. While that's going round and round, I've got marching band drums gradually fading up in the background, while everything else slightly goes off the rails. So the seagull noises come back, played backwards, and with the effect on them going a bit more haywire. The mellotron starts to veer a bit off course as well. So by the end, there's this kind of maelstrom of different sounds going on. Obviously, I wanted to make a video for it. Tricky one to do. Normally, I'd find some footage of the singer performing the song and then just work in some other bits around it. Unfortunately, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay was released after Otis's death, so there's literally no footage of him performing it anywhere. I still wanted him to be present in the video, obviously, so I found some footage of him performing his cover of Shake by Sam Cooke. Obviously, it doesn't really sync up at all, so I slowed that down, just occasional bits of it kind of, or at least vaguely in time, so it goes slightly with the music. And then just paired that up with lots of old home movie footage that I found. So there are bits of seaside footage and bits of footage from the Haight-Ashbury area of San Francisco around 1967, just for that sort of period feel. I think it kind of evokes something of the feel that I wanted to achieve with the song. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this week's. I certainly had fun making it, and hopefully it sounds like what it's meant to without sounding in any way disrespectful to the memory of Otis Redding, because I most certainly wouldn't ever want to disrespect Otis's memory. It was one of the all-time greats. But yeah, it was a fun experiment, and hopefully you'll have fun listening to it. If you did enjoy it, please do like and subscribe and share it around, tell your friends, it all helps. And if there's anything else you'd like me to try in the future, any songs you'd like me to have a go at, any artists you'd like me to take a look at, or any genres you'd like me to try and work something into, please do let me know. I'm always happy to have a go, even if it doesn't work out. You know, I'll give it my best shot. But yeah, that's all for this week. So there'll be a new music video coming up on Monday. I've got some spooky themed content coming up for all of the month of October, so hopefully you'll enjoy that. Until then, that's all from me. See you next time.